David, you asked why I'm optimistic. I just came back from a whole week at the IMF World Bank meetings where it was all finance ministers and central bankers. And when I went into the week, I thought, okay, it's going to be doom and gloom. This is a panel I did yesterday with finance ministers, UK, Germany, Argentina. I thought it was going to be doom and gloom. We're just going to have to deal with the tariffs. The U.S. is crazy. We're going to try to figure out what Trump wants. I was pleasantly surprised. There was not a lot of that. There was a lot of, we know what we have to do. We'll bring concessions to the U.S. We'll get this deal done. But you know what countries are doing? They're using it as a wake-up call, and they're fixing their own economies. Germany's doing this spending on infrastructure and defense. The UK, I was there with Rachel Reeves, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. She actually has a meeting with Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, today about trade. I was able to catch up with her yesterday about what her expectations are for that meeting. Here's what she said.
I think there is a deal to be done. We recognise, though, that both sides need to play their part, and we would also look to make it easier for US companies to export to the UK. We think that's in both our interests. But beyond the tariffs, I know that is the issue of the moment, but beyond that, there's so much more that the UK and US can do together. On technology, for example.
And she talked about, the services back and forth and how that's such an important part of the conversation as well. They're probably hoping that the pharma tariffs don't go through because that would affect a lot of the exports from the UK to the U.S. But UK is in good shape because we actually don't really have a big trade deficit. It's kind of a balanced trade situation.
They didn't get hit very hard reciprocally.
Well, they get a 10%, and they also have to
10%.
10%, yeah. But they get, the steel and aluminum, potentially autos as well, would factor in there.
Steel and aluminum coming from there to here?
Correct. So we have steel and aluminum. No, not a ton, but it makes it 10% is not blanket. Like Lagarde was explaining to me.
No, I know.
Europe,
I was just thinking the
there
UK
are other
in particular.
There.
I don't think that they export a lot of steel.
They care about autos and they care about pharmaceuticals mostly. Right. Those are the two. Either way, what I heard was kind of constructive on not just the trade negotiations, but just what countries are doing. Intra-Europe trade, you heard Lagarde talk a lot about that. The UK was talking about UK-Europe trade. Remember, they exited the EU and they sort of broke off the relationship and trade dropped between the two. Now they're talking, the divorcees are talking about
it's like,
working together
should we try again? She's on the tape this morning in the FT saying that Britain's trade ties with the EU are, quote, even more important than the ones with America.
There was a lot of that talk and about getting emerging markets to lower trade barriers with each other, which is not to say just ex-US, but if we do start seeing more trading and more tariff and non-tariff barriers drop, that's obviously good for growth.